Okay, thank you, Professor Alam, for the generous introduction. Today, we're going to be looking at the impact of globalization on security. So, just to recap. Oops. Maybe I should go back here. Just to recap. What are the main features of the national security paradigm, which we looked at yesterday? So at the beginning of each lecture, I'll see how much you remember of the previous lecture.
Statism, self-help, and survival.
Okay, excellent. Now, what does statism mean? Please, again, identify yourself. Actually, okay.
Monopoly of the legitimacy over the resources.
Excellent, but what is that? What?
State is the basic unit of...
State is an important factor in international relations.
Not an important factor. You gave me a definition of what? What did you define? Of the state itself. Yeah, of the state itself. Excellent. But what is statism? It's not important. It's more important than important.
It is the basic unit of...
Yeah. So basically, the state is seen as the only actor within international relations, the basic unit of international relations. So if we look at the United Nations, the power of the United Nations is circumscribed by its membership, constrained by its membership. What do you need to be in order to be a member of the UN? You need to be a state. But it's not just any state. Yeah, and what do we call internationally recognized states? Sovereign states, yeah. So you need to be a sovereign state. Now, there are two dimensions of sovereignty which we isolated. An internal dimension and an external dimension. External refers to the idea of recognition. Now, coming back to the internal understanding of sovereignty, what is a state? So please tell me the definition.
To have the right to solve all the problems.
No, you gave me a definition earlier. That's why, that's why I'm coming back to you. No, legitimacy is not the main thing. Huh?
Monopoly of use of power within its territory.
Yes, yes, exactly. It's the control over the territory, which is important. Yeah, usually states have that monopoly of the use of force, but we hope they don't always use that force. But the point is the control, having that monopoly over the use of force within a given territory gives a state internal sovereignty. So unless a state has a monopoly of the use of force over a given territory, it cannot be seen as sovereign. So again, if we look at Western policy towards Syria, Western policy towards Syria is based on the idea that we don't like IS, we don't like Daesh, we don't like the Assad regime, we like these little liberals who are hiding amongst Daesh in parts of Aleppo. But they don't have a monopoly of the use of force within a given territory. From a realist point of view, there's only two choices. You either go for Assad or you go for Daesh. So it's having that monopoly over the use of force within a given territory which gives the state it's not only its legitimacy, but its sovereignty. Legitimacy is secondary to sovereignty. And the most important point is that the power of the state is exercised over a territory. It's geopolitical. It's not biopolitical. I'm going to be introducing you, hopefully, to biopolitics later in the course. Biopolitics refers to power over people. Geopolitics is power over territory. So as Indian nationals, the Indian state is powerless to help you if you decide to volunteer and go to Syria or to go to Iraq or to go to Indonesia. Then the state cannot help you because you have physically left the borders of India. Then you need the protection of the state in which territory you are. So it's a geopolitical concept. Good. So we've understood the idea of the state and statism, which is the key actor within international relations, not the nation. So we always conflate the idea of nation with state. Nation refers to people. It can be an imagined community, it can be a real community. But the state is defined in terms of power, in terms of its control over a particular territory. So, if we look at states, what is their best strategy according to the national security paradigm? Should they all join together and cooperate and live happily ever after?
Self-help.
Why self-help?
Anarchy is there in the economy.
Excellent, yeah. The governing principle, let's go back to the lecture, so this will give you an opportunity for those who may not have been here yesterday or who didn't take notes. Oops. Yeah, so basically we isolated three key assumptions: statism, self-help, and survival. If we look at self-help, it's based on the idea that states have no option but to depend upon themselves. This is the insight of Kenneth Waltz in his theory of international politics. Beforehand, realists were making assumptions about human nature and scaling up from human nature to the level of the state. So if we look at the work of Hobbes, the idea of the individual in a state of nature is that the state of nature is a war of every man against every man. Life is seen as nasty, brutish, and short. Therefore, we have no option but to try and fight for survival. So a whole generation of theorists, beginning with Hans Morgenthau and beforehand, to a lesser extent, E.H. Carr, scaled up from the level of the individual to the state. And then Kenneth Waltz, in his theory of international politics, said, we cannot make assumptions about individuals because states are completely different. But the one assumption we can make about the international system is that it's an anarchic realm. It's governed by anarchy. There is no, that's the ordering principle of the system. This is fundamentally different from politics. Beforehand, international relations or international politics were seen as part of politics. But Waltz pointed out a fundamental difference which is within the political realm, we have the state. There is a monopoly of the use of force, but there is no monopoly of the use of force globally. That's the key difference. So anarchy means that states have no option but to help themselves, to trust themselves. And I didn't have time to tell you about Walz's application of Walz's theory to conventional international relations history. But one of the biggest problems which many historians of international relations have faced is if you look at the First World War and the Second World War, who were the main protagonists? So let's look at the First World War in Europe 100 years ago. Who were the main protagonists within that war? Who fought in that war? Which states? Remember, we're realists, at least for another couple of minutes. So we're realists for another couple of minutes. Which states fought in the First World War? Which states fought in the Second World War? Well, no, I want the First World War first. Yeah, I mean, basically we're looking at sides. So who fought against whom? Huh?
Austro-Hungarians against Germany.
Austro-Hungarians against Germany? Okay, let's work from the Second World War back. If you could, one at a time. So name me one state which took part in the First World War. Germany. Okay. Now, who was on their side in the First World War? Austria. Okay. Let's look at the Second World War. Who was on Germany's side in the Second World War? Yeah, Italy, Japan, and also what was part of Germany in the Second World War? Austria. So Germany and Austria are always together. Italy actually was not together. Japan was not together. But who was fighting against the Germans? Who was always fighting against the Germans, even today, you could say? Huh? UK and France. So UK and France are always fighting against Germany, even when it comes to soccer. Now, who actually won the Second World War? Who actually won the Second World War? Who also does Germany fight against? Huh? Yeah, but which important one? No. US never fought against Germany. US waited. Sorry? Yes, what was Russia called? Germany lost the Second World War against the Soviet Union. Then you had Dunkirk. You first had Stalingrad, then you had Saving Private Ryan, you know, the movie. So Stalingrad was the main battle. Now, in the First World War, who was Germany fighting? So Britain, France, and who else was the Allied power? Russia. Now, what happened to Russia between the First World War and the Second World War? So Russia 100 years ago exactly versus Russia in the Second World War. What had happened to Russia? What was it called? Yes, and what was it called? Bolshevik Revolution. Now, if we look at Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister, he hated the Bolshevik Revolution. He launched an invasion of it in 1919, an attempt to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle. He actually quite liked Germany. You know, he didn't want to give India independence. He liked the idea of a white world order. But we see Britain and France still allied with the Soviet Union against Germany in the First World War and the Second World War. So Walz's argument is you don't have to like your allies. It's power politics itself means that you are forced into alliances in order to balance power globally. So a similar argument would be if we look at Indo-Japanese relations. So India and Japan may not like each other. Actually, the prime ministers, Modi and Abe, like each other very much. But they may not like each other, but still, in order to balance the power of China, India and Japan are forced together, are forced to balance China's power. So this is the basic principles of how international relations work. So the national security paradigm basically is based on the idea that the state has the primary responsibility to provide security. In actual fact, it is the only legitimate provider of security. Security is defined as protection from external aggression by other states. And the best means of providing security is through increased military power. So notice here Schmitt's idea of the friend-enemy distinction. All states have friends, all states have enemies, but there are no permanent friends, no permanent allies. So this is basically the hegemonic paradigm within security studies, even today. Certainly if you look at the Trump administration, maybe they've heard of the national security paradigm. They've certainly never heard of human security. But this would be the dominant way of looking at the world today. Now, the key question which we have to ask ourselves is, does this paradigm, can this paradigm provide security for us globally? We know that it can provide security for states, but what about people? And this is where we have to engage with globalization. So this lecture will look at globalization and security. I'll be introducing you first to the globalization debate. Sorry. Okay, just a second. Oops. Okay. Now, the first point which we'll be looking at will be defining globalization, and this may take some time. Secondly, I'll introduce you to the contending theories of the globalization debate. I hope we can finish this during this lecture, then have a break, and then maybe have a discussion. But the main focus is looking on the implications for security and different types of security, particularly the emergence of non-traditional security threats. And then we can have a final discussion, and I can suggest further reading. Now let's start with globalization. Now, I am not interested in whether you think globalization now is a good thing or a bad thing. So in this slide, we're just trying to define what globalization is. Many people, and arguably the majority of people in the world today, would refute the entire idea of globalization. We've seen a strong support for the anti-globalist stance on the right of President Trump in the United States, on the left of presidential candidate Sanders. Within the European Union, on the right, the pro-Brexit vote within the UK. On the left, we find Syriza and the leftist fronts within Greece and Podemos within Spain. So even within the heartland of the West, where the idea of globalization was born in many senses, there's been a rejection of it. What I'm interested in right now is your understanding of globalization. Now, this could take hours, because globalization is arguably, as a concept, a more nebulous concept even than human security. But I would like to start by saying that this is my favorite definition of globalization. So how can this be seen as a definition of globalization?
Worldwide interconnectedness.
Go ahead.
I said worldwide interconnectedness.
Interconnections?
Worldwide interconnectedness. It's like a web of, connections.
How can you see the connections? It's the image, which is important.
Actually, there is no boundary.
This is interesting. You say there's no boundary, which is great, but whenever I teach this in Japan, they say, oh, we can easily see Japan. But yeah, no boundaries. But more importantly, what is the image? Huh? Sorry, this is a PowerPoint which I got from Japan, so that's why it's Asia. The globe, yeah. So the idea of globalization comes from a particular shape. So this is the globe. The globe refers to the planet Earth. Now this is the question. Why ization? So we can understand the globe. The globe's always been there. But why globalization? Ization means to make into a globe. Was the world flat beforehand, and did it have to be molded into a globe?
Flow of national interest and
Sorry?
flow of national interest and
Nationalism?
God national interest.
national interest.
National interest. God national interest.
One nation to our nation.
I'm not sure about that. Yeah?
Operating on international scale.
No, not international. Because the term global is different from international.
Worldwide.
That's not worldwide.
Then what is the difference between international and globalization?
Okay, this is a question. It's an excellent question. I spend a lot of time doing it. Maybe you can help me with it. What's the difference between international and global?
International is between the nations and it has certain limitations. But globally is global is something related to world as a whole.
Isn't the national as a whole global?
Globalization is more about states.
Is more what?
More about states. Internationalism speaks like whole of the globe is like stateless, in a stateless.
It's like universalization of the concept. Isn't it like universalization of the concepts?
I like the idea of universalization. But I think if I could just snip this argument in the bud. When we talk of globalization, we're talking about this particular shape. How do we know the world looks like this? Actually, it doesn't look like this because it's a particularly clear day. But how do we know the shape is shaped like a globe?
So the entire earth is our home.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
The entire earth is our home. It's looking like that.
Yeah, but how do we know this? Think of your grandparents. Did they know this? I mean, they knew it, but how? What proof? We have to provide proof. What proof can we provide?
The satellite images. The satellite images.
Excellent. Of what?
The images of the Earth.
So how do we need to get these images? Can we just do it with our cell phones from here on Earth?
It's technology.
Yeah, but how do we do this? How do we take a picture of the planet Earth? How do you take a selfie of the planet Earth?
Through the satellites.
Through?
Through the satellites.
Excellent, yeah. So the term globalization was really born,
To communication is.
yeah, through communications once you had the launching of the world's first satellites. Beforehand, you still had ideas of worlds. How many worlds did we live in the 1960s, 1970s, right up to the 1990s? If we look at the idea of worlds, how many worlds did we live in? India was a clear player in one of these worlds.
Yeah, it's first world, second world,
third world.
Excellent. Yeah, you had three worlds. The first world, the so-called advanced liberal democracies or capitalist societies. The second world, the communist societies. And then the third world, the non-aligned movement, of which India was probably the leading member.
Fourth has won the failed states, Somalia and all that.
Yeah, but that's after 90. That's after, yeah. The point here of the three worlds is that this was a political concept, the idea that we lived in three worlds. We didn't actually physically live within three worlds. You didn't, you need an oxygen mask in order to go to the Soviet Union or the West. But we did live in three different systems, political systems, economic systems, and systems of defense and security alignments. Now, if we look at globalization, the definition of globalization, it's based on the idea that we are becoming a globe. Now, we can only become a globe once we realize that we are a globe. And although, Columbus in 1492, which for me, is actually the beginning of globalization. It's 1492. It's not the 1960s. It's not 1990. But with satellite technology, we have proof that the world looks like a globe. Now, what does it mean to have a global problem? When we say that there are global problems, it's different between international. International problems means this is a problem internationally for states. But what would be a global problem? Again, let's look at the shape of the Earth. This conversation is going in a particular direction because I want to look at the shape. So globalization is based, firstly, at least according to the conventional accounts. I don't agree with the conventional accounts, but it's based on the idea that we have irrefutable proof that we live in one globe, in one planet, the planet Earth. The world is not divided into three. Secondly, it's based on the idea that we're progressively moving towards this idea that we live in one world. People beforehand and people still today may deny the fact that we live in one world. But what I'm asking for is an example of a global problem rather than an international problem.
Global warming.
Excellent, yeah. So it's really when global warming happened that people woke up to the fact that we have to do something. Now, interestingly, where was the issue when we looked at global warming? I remember precisely in the 87. So what did we see in 87? I was, old enough to be born, to be alive then. Many of you may have been born afterwards. But what did we see in the late 80s, 90s? Still, yeah, go ahead.
Melting ice.
Huh?
Melting ice.
Where? Excellent. Where?
Poles.
Yeah, which pole in particular?
Outer pole.
Yeah, Antarctica. Why was it important that it was Antarctica?
We had glaciers in the region from there.
Sorry?
We had glaciers, glaciers from there.
Yeah, but I mean,
And the rise of sea levels.
yeah, but the rise of sea level, Bangladesh has had rising sea levels for 30, 40 years. Nobody seems to care that much apart from Bangladesh. What was really important about this? What was really important about Antarctica?
It was covering from the outer side and going deep inside.
It hits the western world directly. They are the first speed of
Ozone layer got ozone.
Okay, it's a hole in the ozone layer. So who does it affect? It affects everybody. Everybody in the globe. Not just people. Everything in the globe. Now, this is the key question. According to the national security paradigm, whose responsibility is it? National security paradigm? Humans don't exist. And which state controls the Antarctica?
There is nobody.
Exactly. Nobody. It's nobody's responsibility. It is not a security threat, according to the national security paradigm. So for the national security paradigm, the fact there's a huge gaping hole in the ozone layer is not a threat. This is not like the Soviet Union invading or China invading. So, but my question is it a security threat?
Yeah, as a whole it is environmental threat.
Well, it could be, yeah, and the idea of the environment. It could,
Influence everybody.
yeah, this was the main argument, which is that there are some things which the national security paradigm cannot protect you from. There are some non-traditional security threats which actually are more important than invasion from another state. Now, in terms of a definition of globalization, this is perhaps... a most generic definition by Anthony Giddens during his Reith lectures of 1999, when he said globalization has something to do with the thesis that we all now live in one world. Now, he said this in 1999. Why is he saying it then? Why is he saying now? We always lived in one world. So what has changed when we look at globalization?
in 1989, Soviet Union disintegrated. So that was when a lot of countries moved towards towards independence.
Excellent. Apart from countries don't exist, but go on, yeah.
And India became a free market. Just like.
But
In 1992 Rio conference, which is
yeah, okay. Now, these are all correct answers. These are all very good answers, and I think broadly they're correct. But that's not my question. My question is based on the idea that globalization has something to do with the thesis that we now live in one world. So one answer is that we now live in one world because of the collapse of Soviet-based communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But so what? What happened after the Berlin Wall? What happened to the Soviet Union? No. I have another slide on Poland. We didn't finish that, the lecture yesterday. But basically, your understand the offensive and defensive realism, your answer to that question determines the world in which we live in. So I wouldn't say it's unipolar. That's still looking at it in a realist way. So, but what happened in terms of to the Soviet Union? Let's look at it economically.
Neoliberal economic policies have been introduced throughout the world.
Yeah, neoliberalism, exactly, I agree, but neoliberalism is a variant of one economic system. What is this economic system? Yeah, basically we talk in terms of the globalization of capitalism. And in this sense, the opening up of China in 1980 is far more important than the collapse of the Soviet Union. Basically, the argument could be that globalization economically can be traced back to the opening up of China in 1980. Because we then economically lived in a single world economy, global capitalist economy. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet Union was basically absorbed into the global economy. But there was no alternative to capitalism. That was the idea. There is no alternative. There's only one economic system. So that's why in 1992, arguably Manmohan Singh had no alternative but to change India's fiscal policy because of limited foreign currency reserves. It wasn't that he was in favor of neoliberalism. Arguably, there's nothing else that the Narasimha Rao government could have done because globally, the world had changed. There was only one economic system. It was not unipolar. You could have a multipolar world system. China's still there. But economically, there's only capitalism. So I think this is one answer. But another answer lies with the previous discussion of the environment. So if we look at the ozone layer, we find a hole in the ozone layer. We look around and say, whose responsibility is it? If the ozone layer keeps widening, then all of us will die. We have to do something. Now, the idea of we having to do something not for our citizens, but for the globe, is new. That's what's new about globalization. The idea that we all now live in one world, whether we like it or not. So what Giddens is saying is, look, there's still people, probably in the United States, in Britain, who don't believe we live in one world. They believe they live in their own world, planet America or planet Britain, Little Britain. And they think they're different from everybody else. But the main argument is we all live in one world. This is a fact. This has always been a fact. We've always lived in one world. The difference is our consciousness of this. We're only now aware of the fact that we live in one world. We have evidence. We have satellite photographs showing we live in one world. And we also have global problems which cannot be dealt with by individual states. So this is really at the heart of any understanding of globalization. Now, secondly, what happens to power? So if we live in a global world, we're looking at political science. Political science is about power. We have to talk to the realists. So the realists are saying, yeah, very well, a hole in the ozone layer, but what does this do to power? What does a global economy, which during the 1990s was run in Washington, D.C., part of the Washington Consensus. So you had the IMF, the World Bank, and you also had the US State Department, very close to one another. This is what we mean by the Washington Consensus. So what does it mean, therefore, to talk in terms of globalization? How does this affect power? We can understand how it affects the environment and how it affects economics, but how does this affect power? What happens to power?
I think when we think of globalization, the first thing that comes against it, contrary, is the very idea of sovereignty. When borders become porous, the whole concept of sovereignty is hijacked in a sense.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. I agree with this, and we're going to look at sovereignty later. Excellent. But let us look at power. Is power there or is power not there? What happens to power?
It is increasing day by day. State's power is increasing day by day.
Sorry?
State's power is increasing day by day.
State's power is increasing. That's one view.
Even if there's a globalization, it is not diminishing.
That's the globalization debate. That's my next question. That will be, we can have a discussion of that after the lecture. But that's an opinion. That's an assumption.
If we think of states' power increasing because of globalization, I think that's to do with only certain states and not all.
Yeah, but that's the discussion. That's not my question. My point is power still there? What happens to power?
Power isn't that much important as compared to the resources of
The-
the economic aspect.
These are excellent points, but they're all arguments.
The nature of power changes.
That's it.
Power is still there,
Yeah,
but the
that's it.
nature of
That's it. Excellent, yeah. Basically, the argument is just as other things get globalized, power gets globalized. Now, as we'll see later, this could mean that states get strengthened, but it also could mean that power goes away from the state and we have failed states. So, but the point here is that power itself is being transformed. So Anthony McGrew, who actually wrote a lot of the books for Giddens, defined globalization as a historical process involving a fundamental shift or transformation in the spatial scale of human social organization that links distant communities and expands the reach of power relations across regions and continents. Now, you don't need to write all of this down, but the point I'm trying to make here is that for McGrew, power is still there, but power expands. It's no longer contained within the temporal boundaries of the spatial boundaries of the nation state. It's freed from its geographical container. Now, this may mean that state power is strengthened. We'll see that later. But the strengthening of state power in one part of the world may mean a weakening of state power in another part of the world. So we'll see it. We're not saying that the state is more powerful or less powerful as a result of globalization. But what we are saying is that the nature of power is changing. Power is located in different centers. This is the point to make about globalization.
So, can we say that previously it was more about regarding the control of the territory by the different
Yeah,
nations?
yeah.
But now the economic concept is getting more valid. Because like even Japan is not controlled that much territory, but Japan is a powerful state than a larger country.
Yeah, excellent, but this is one argument. The point is I need to finish. What I want to do in the remaining time is go through the globalization debate. What I've put on the board so far is an assumption, but it should not be that controversial. It's not an argument. Now I want to make 3 arguments based on globalization. This is what we call the globalization debate. So the globalization debate, the first school of thought are the globalists. Now globalists broadly, or the hyper-globalists as Giddens refers to them, the globalists basically believe in globalization. Their idea is that globalization is inevitable. We should embrace globalization. So many neoliberals are globalists, but also some Marxists as well are globalists. If you look at the work of Karl Marx, he would be a globalist. He believed in an international, workers of the world unite. Workers of the world unite is a globalist position. So the main argument globalists are making, as we'll see, is that the state is increasingly less powerful. Boundaries and borders are less important. Therefore, the national security paradigm is obsolete. We need a new security paradigm. Secondly, skeptics. Skeptics don't believe globalization exists. And if they believe globalization exists, they believe that it is a myth which is fed by state elites, by powerful states, in order for other states to open up their markets to multinational corporations. Now, broadly, there are two types of skeptics. The best way of thinking about the skeptical position is to look at the US presidential election. Because until the US presidential election, the recent one, most people throughout the world thought that globalization was, most skeptics throughout the world thought that globalization was part of this vast US-led Western neo-imperialist conspiracy to try and basically open up the internal markets of large states such as India and China to steal its biodiversity and to make huge profits. And this was not in the interests of the working classes within the West, and it was not in the interest of the exploited subaltern peoples in the rest of the world. So Vandana Shiva is a good example of a skeptic in terms of an anti-globalist skeptic. However, if we look at the previous US presidential election, we find that even within the United States, which is meant to have been at the heart for skeptics of this great myth of globalization, even within the United States, Americans believed that it was part of a conspiracy. They probably thought it was part of a Clinton Chinese-Indian conspiracy to deprive American workers of their jobs. But the key point to make is that there are many skeptics. The world, the United States, the President of the United States is a skeptic when it comes to globalization, even though he's made billions as a result of it. So the key argument to make is that skeptics are no longer confined to the global South. There are skeptics in the global North as well. And we can make a distinction between what we could call neo-traditional skeptics, people like Trump, people like the UK Independence Party, the right-wing groups across Germany and much of Europe, and also those on the left, Podemos within Spain, Syriza within Greece, various left fronts. I don't know about the position of the CPM at the moment, the Naxalites within India. These would all be skeptics who are part of the left. So it basically cuts across the left-right boundaries. And the final school of thought are the transformationalists. Now, transformationalists would say, look, we live in a world in which everything is changing. We live in what Giddens would call a runaway world. Now, in this runaway world, power is running away from us. It no longer can be contained by the state. We need more government, not less government, but we don't know. We need different types of government. Think of the internet. Think of internet fraud. Okay, as a result of demonetization, you in India are going to have to get online. Even as a foreigner coming in here, I can't withdraw a lot of money, which means I'm going to have to rely upon a credit card. What happens if you don't have a credit card? You have to get a credit card. Now, once you have a credit card, and you need a secure server. If you don't have a secure server, then somebody can steal your credit card details. Now, what does the national security paradigm has to say about this? How can national security help you safeguard the security of your own personal credit history or information? Now, they can prevent a cyber attack from China or North Korea, but how can they help you maintain your own credit history? How can they secure you from credit card theft and theft of details? So this is an example of actually we need more government, but different types of government. So the nature of state power is changing. The nature of power is changing. Let me go through all of these schools of thought in detail. and then we will pause for the break. So for globalists, sorry, the key argument is that globalization is eroding state power, making it less important. Now, what do you understand by erosion? Is erosion, obviously, if you're a geologist, it's a geological concept. But what do you understand by when you see the idea of eroding state power?
Withering away.
Excellent, yeah, withering away. So what globalists are not saying is states are going to disappear overnight. States are still going to be there, but states are becoming less and less important in our life. The Japanese business economist Kenichio Mai, 25 years ago, talked in terms of the end of the nation state. So the nation state, when he meant the end of the nation state, he didn't mean nation states would cease to exist. But what he meant to say was the end of the nation state as an economic model. This is about the time of NAFTA and also the expansion of the EU. Small states can't survive on their own. Big states like India can, but small states can't. Even Britain cannot survive on its own. So this leads to a borderless economy. So we can still have lots of different states, lots of different nation states, but at the same time we have one economic system, a borderless global economy. Eventually, this will lead to the emergence of what Mary Caldor at my institution, the London School of Economics, terms a global civil society. Now, the basic unit of the global civil society is seen as the individual and not the state or the community. So global civil society is different from understanding the idea of civil society. So civil society in liberal political thought is seen as that which is not the state. Now the problem with global civil society is there is no global state. So how can we live in a global civil society? It makes no sense. But what they are saying is that this global civil society is existing, it's emerging. Why? Because of the market, because of a global economy. The nature of state power is changing. So the state should therefore create the minimum conditions necessary for the maintenance of a market economy and leave it alone. The state should not interfere within the economy. This is neoliberalism, neoliberal arguments. But even many Marxists would say, look, the state itself cannot deal with problems of a particular state. Okay, in a big state like India or China, there is a role for the state. But in small states, if you look at dependency theory in the 1970s, the argument was you delink from the world economy and you can build socialism in one country. Well, let's look where it was tried out. Chile, unfortunately, wasn't tried out. Cuba was tried out. And then after the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had within Cuba an opening up of the market. North Korea, the market is still closed. Did it work there? Even in Nepal, which is Maoist, I went to Nepal and I interviewed some of the leaders there, and they were saying, look, we need more capitalism. We need more capitalism in order to reach socialism. So the argument here is that the state itself needs to encourage capitalism because we live in a borderless economy. Basically, globalization is seen as a positive phenomenon. It's inevitable. We are going to live in one world. We're going to live in a world where nationality doesn't matter, where state borders are no longer important. That's not the world we live in at the moment, but there's a clear historical trajectory, a clear linear idea of progress towards a global civil society. Okay, I'll hurry up. I hope that was understandable. I'll take questions later. But now I'd like to get to the skeptical argument. The skeptics say, no, not true. That's rubbish. Basically, globalization is a myth. And if it isn't a myth, it's very, very harmful. Globalization is actually reinforcing, strengthening state power in the developed world. particularly its security functions. Those of you who travel will find this. You know, I have to come to India and I need a visa. I need a particular visa, a conference visa, because I'm guest of the government of India in Jamia. So it means I have to apply. I have to pay money to the Indian embassy in order to get this visa. I cannot come into India without that visa. Now, I get onto a plane, and what happens? All sorts of biometric testing. Now, beforehand, this biometric testing particularly was introduced after 9/11 in order to stop so-called potential terrorists from going into, let's say, the developed societies of the West. But now it has been extended to citizens, and particularly with President Trump, it will be extended to citizens, American citizens, arguably of Muslim origin. So what we see is that the state itself is getting more powerful. I remember in 2005, after the 7th of July terrorist attacks, the attackers were identified on CCTV within 24 hours. I didn't realize that the whole of London is on CCTV. This is not the United States, but basically all of your movements are taped. I never consented to this. Nobody said, you know, like they do today, can we tape your lectures? Yes, Jan can take my lectures because they're paying me for it. But walking around the streets of London, I didn't consent to having my every movement monitored. Now, where does this information go to? It goes to the state. So how can we say the state is less important? It's becoming more important to our everyday lives. So even when I go to the United States, I see American citizens in the United States. Now they have their fingerprints taken. They have their pictures taken. Beforehand, it was just foreigners. But now even Americans have these pictures taken. What happens to all this data, to this data? So we find that the security functions of the state is being reinforced. Examples are tighter immigration controls. I'm working at the moment in London School of Economics on the European refugee crisis. Actually, when you look at the migration, because it's not really a refugee crisis, it's a migrant crisis, when you look at the numbers, yes, it's a huge number, but it's less than the number of migrants who live in Lebanon, who live in Pakistan after the Afghan wars. You know, Lebanon has 1.5 million Syrians. Hungary doesn't even want to take one Syrian refugee. So these tighter immigration controls, particularly in the British referendum on whether to remain within the EU, the main images were of Syrians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis coming in illegally into Britain. Actually, the British immigration figures have remained remarkably consistent. There hasn't been this great increase, but there's been tighter immigration controls, increased military spending, environmental and anti-terrorist legislation. One thing I always am interested in, I'm not a smoker, but look at smoking laws, how tight smoking is. Now in certain parts of Europe and also Japan where they used to smoke a lot, you can't smoke inside a building, you can't smoke outside. So I've seen smokers in these glass places in train stations in Japan, and they smoke, and you see the smoke sort of coming out. It's like almost like a sort of smoke camp, you know, like some, I thought there was a fire when I first saw it. But this shows you the power of the state to tell you what to do, to tell you whether to smoke. In India, you don't seem to have the same recycling laws in other places, but in Japan, it's very, very strict. You know, I can't put my cans at the same place as my plastics. I have to separate the cans and the plastics from normal rubbish. So this constant period of having to basically sort your rubbish out is actually quite important, because Anthony McGrew, a globalization theorist, had the same problem and said, I think the state is still important, telling people what to do in terms of how they sort their rubbish out. But the important point to make here is there's more government. There's more role for the state. So state power in the developing world, you could argue, is weakened by the activities of IGOs, particularly the IMF, World Bank. We have failed states, like Somalia, arguably like Syria, Democratic Republic of Congo, arguably Afghanistan, where the main control of the security functions are taken by non-government organizations. But these represent the interests of developed states. So this is seen as part of a neo-imperialism. I mean, this argument, you could argue, is particularly strong when you look at international NGOs, because international NGOs are not responsible for the people they help. They're responsible for their donors. Donors are the people who give them money. So sometimes there are boxes which they tick. So they, for example, in faith-based donor groups, they would say, if it's somebody with a strong Christian background or even Muslim background, they would not want money to go into helping HIV research. So they'll say no. That means that an international NGO cannot help people victims of AIDS or looking at HIV research. So basically the key argument is donors are who? Donors are usually represented in the developed world. So they look after the interests of the developed world. So the skeptical argument basically sees globalization as a negative phenomenon. And we saw this in the US presidential election. So Bernie Sanders did very well in terms of mobilizing the support of those within the Rust Belt who were disaffected by globalization, who had lost their jobs. But after he was defeated in the race by Hillary Clinton, who was associated with globalization because of the reforms of Bill Clinton, what we had was President Trump picking up their votes because he was against NAFTA. He was against people stealing their jobs. So the skeptical argument sees globalization as a negative phenomenon. Okay, very briefly, so I think I have maybe 5 minutes left. Let's look at the transformationalist view. Okay, 2 minutes left. We can expand upon this later. So the current debate has been between globalists who believe that globalization is inevitable and that globalization is broadly a positive phenomenon, and skeptics who believe that A, globalization doesn't exist, and B, if it does exist, it's basically a myth used by developed societies and by powerful elites against, to open up domestic markets and to downsize economies. So it's seen as a negative phenomenon for skeptics. Now, transformationists argue that globalization is neither a positive nor negative phenomenon. Globalization is transforming state power in both the developed and developing world. We cannot talk in terms of global north and global south. So the global north exists here within Delhi, as well as the global south. You can go to the Taj Hotel here, and you can pay, the Taj Hotel in Delhi is probably more expensive than the Taj Hotel in London or the Taj Hotel in New York. You have some of the most expensive, if we look at Mumbai in the 1990s, it was more expensive than Tokyo in terms of office prices. So the global north exists within the global south. The global south exists within the global north. Look at the people who, in the United States, many of them ended up supporting President Trump, were from disadvantaged backgrounds. So globalization here is seen as transforming, changing state power in both the developed and developing world. But it's still there. The state is still important, but it can no longer provide governance and security for its citizens on its own. It must work together with local, regional, and international governmental and non-governmental organizations to combat the negative effects of globalization. And this is the important point. What transformationists stress is that globalization exists. So they agree with globalists. Globalization exists. It's happening. But what they're not saying is that we know where it's going. Transformationists are saying we don't know where it's going. We live in a runaway world. It depends on us. We have to try and control the world. We don't know if the world today is better than the world 20 or 30 years ago. The world is richer. We don't know if the world is more secure. So basically, we all need to work together. There needs to be more governance, but there are more centers of governance. There's more centers of power. Power is no longer contained in the geographic container of the state. So they point to the emergence of a global civil society coexisting and working together with the sovereign state system to provide global governance. It's not either or. It's not the state or global civil society. For them, it's the state system and global civil society, state and civil society. So if you want to combat the negative effects of globalization, so transformationists stress the negative effects of globalization. So if you wanted to combat this, then we need to work together. States need to work together with NGOs, INGOs, UN agencies. Think of floods, think of famines, think of earthquakes. The earthquake which hit Nepal a couple of years ago. Now the Nepalese government said, look, we're a poor country. We've just come out of a civil war. We cannot deal with this on our own. We need help from the outside world. We need help from non-governmental organizations, from other states. We're going to do our job as well, but we need this help and support. So basically, to conclude, multiple centers of sovereignty exist. It's no longer just the nation state. Power is still there. The state is still there. But the state needs help in order to provide security. And as we'll see later, this is where human security fits in. Okay, I'll leave this slide on the board just in case you want to copy it down. But we'll break for tea, and then we'll be back at 3:30. So we'll be back at 3:30, and we'll resume the lecture. But I may ask you which one of these arguments you find most convincing. Okay, thank you. It's not the national security paradigm. You can share microphones.
Actually, sir, what he was saying that these states cannot security. Yes, sir. It is according to the transformationalists also. That it is you just gave one of the point that the state is still important, but cannot longer provide governance and security for its citizens on its own.
Yeah, that's transformationalist.
Yes, sir. So it must work together with the NATO, European Union, all these regional organizations like ASEAN, SAARC. So it is somewhat like globalist.
Okay, yeah, that would be transformationalist, correct? But we're looking at globalists. Now, considering India has benefited from participating within a global economy, I thought there'll be more globalists here. So, Akhtar, go ahead.
So can't there be the fusion of both of them, transformationalist, globalist?
No, I'm not going to allow you that. You can't be a globalist and a transformationalist.
More of the grayer side. What I'm noticing these 2 days is that we don't go with black, we don't go with white, we always go with the gray side. So gray here are the transformationists.
Yesterday we were talking about offensive realism and defensive realism. That was not gray.
Yesterday I was saying, why can't we just have the 2 qualities both and go with,
Well, they're both realists. That's not gray. I'd say it's very black, but never mind.
this is gray.
Okay, so, but we're looking now at globalists. So, Akhtar, global.
I'll go with globalist side because somehow I feel like we have a lot of global common problems emerging now in terms of land, in terms of air, water, it's called global common tragedies. So there I feel like state power is like many of the states, rather majority of the states in itself are not going to do anything about it. So supranational states are trying to emerge. So it's like only like supranational states can deal with them rather than the individual national states.
Okay, but the key globalist argument is that the state is getting less important. The state being less important does not mean that supranational institutions are going to be more important. It means that we're going to need less and less security. There is a change from security to resilience. Resilience means it's up to the individual to look after themselves. It's up to private companies or corporations to look after themselves. So if you're part of a global network society and you find a job in one part of the world, you may be moved to another part of the world, but you still belong to that company. So I have many students who may be ethnically Japanese, but they've grown up in China, in Argentina, in the United Kingdom. They've always gone to private schools, they've had private health insurance. Wherever they go, it's the same because the company is looking after them. So the idea here is power goes to companies. It's not the state. It's not supranational institutions or organizations, but it's companies and it's individuals who have to be more resilient. We have to look after our own security. Any other globalists? Yeah, thank you.
So today, as we are talking about the non-traditional security threats, as far as the traditional security threats are concerned, then it goes with the military power. The military power can be of different aspects, but as far as the non-traditional security threats are concerned, then I would like to go with the globalist one, because state power, if we talk about the state power, state will become more important in the military one, but on the NSTs, we will have to go with the global aspect. We need to go in consent with the other states also to solve these problems of environment and financial and all, because we cannot be dependent upon a country or a state. So I would like to go with the globalist one because this reason.
Okay, thank you. Could you tell your name to the other members? I know.
Shani.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now there must be lots of skeptics amongst you. Okay.
Myself is Modestus. I am a research scholar in Department of Politics. Sir, Jamia. Sir, to my mind, after 9/11, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, they have made the whole concept of globalization. Because after that, the state power, the power of every state thinks about only the national interest as they are getting more and more important, and the state power is increasing day by day. Although there are many examples of being that the borders are less important, but still states matters in everything. As we discussed these different types of security, while discussing all these, at the 11th hour we settle reach to the state. We are back to the state. So it is actually state which matters.
Yeah, we can have the objections later, but I want to hear from more people who would maybe support the skeptical side. Yep.
I'm still doing PhD in peace and conflict from this university. Globalization, as you rightly pointed out, strengthens state power in a very negative way. Most of the developed welfare or liberal state have become much more stringent, and there's a huge drive of securitization happened. And in the weaker states or developing countries, particularly in Africa, Asia and Latin America, it has a very catastrophic effect on the people. Yet, state has not weakened. Rather, state use their coercive power quite strongly over the people, thereby, decreasing or denying the democratic rights in a bigger way, and having an unregulated and a free entry to the capital forces into their democratic sphere. We have examples of Chile, we have examples of Brazil, we have examples of many countries in Africa, especially so this actually it has increased the state power, which is nothing wrong in it, but it has increased state power in a very negative way. That means state has become an extremely coercive power over its own people for promoting crony capitalism. In fact, the neoliberal economic idea has actually been portrayed or being exercised as crony capitalism. That means complete nepotism. And that actually increased the very process of securitization. You have security all of your life,
Yep.
all spectrum of your life. Thereby, I have no other option but to be a skeptics.
Okay, thank you very much. Yep.
I would like to listen.
Yeah, I'd like to listen to more people if possible. So anybody else is a skeptic?
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm Balul Hansuri, pursuing PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies. I would say that globalization was wonderful, but nobody is practicing it in that way. Be it US or Japan, both are protectionists. They provide subsidies to their farmers. And say Ashraf Ghani in his book Fixing Failed States, he argues that they play with aids, say to some African countries who are producing huge coffee and all. They just give them aid and ask them not to produce them, so that the farmers back home could enjoy on globalization because of their protectionist policies. So, and on security and all, the developed countries are getting too much, and those who are underdeveloped and all, they are suffering a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other skeptics, particularly on this side? Because I like the idea of two different sides. Any other skeptics on this side?
And again, when financial crisis happened in US, everybody came back to the states. Please fund us back.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very important point to make, that the bailout was state taxpayers' money going towards the banking system. However, the state did not nationalize the banking system, which it could have done. So there was less oversight here. Anyway, so any other skeptics? Okay, so the transformationists all over there. So transformationists, yeah, from Calcutta. Presidency
University. I would go with the transformationist viewpoint because, firstly, I think my basic argument is we as human beings, most importantly, we also do have a political identity, which is very important. So, in the globalized world, even though we have porous borders, at the end of the day, we are citizens of a particular country. We're basically arguing here about how the nature of power has changed in a globalized world, and the transformationist argument fits well with this in the sense that the state is not irrelevant, in the sense that it is still the owner of resources, and most importantly, in this context, I would like to bring the whole idea of nuclear power, the reason why the nature of power has changed over time, and the reason why there is so much of focus on regional cooperation and different organizations, because we are constantly confronted by this, the Dependency Debate. So at the end of the day, however, it is the state that is in control of the nuclear weapons. So I think what globalization is basically doing is it's changing certain traditional concepts like sovereignty, like power, and therefore it is the role of the state is certainly changing in this, but it's not getting eroded as such, because important decisions at the end of the day are taken by the heads of the state, no matter how where they belong.
Thank you very much. Just one qualification for this. For a transformationalist perspective, particularly when you look at nuclear weapons, their argument may be the opposite, which is we don't know where they're going. We don't know. That's hence the importance of nuclear, combating nuclear proliferation. It's not that certain states are getting hold of nuclear weapons. It's that there are a lot of nuclear weapons out there, and some of them, let's look at the Ukraine. You know, they were put there by the Soviet Union, who has control over those nuclear weapons. So the Soviet Union may have made nuclear weapons in the Ukraine. They could be pointed at Russia right now. So the point is we don't know who is in control in this sense. So it's still the state is there. The state has a powerful role to play, but the state's role is changing. So I think nuclear weapons, this is a far stronger argument for skeptics. Skeptics would say yes, but it's only the state which has a monopoly of the use of mutually assured destruction. Whereas transformationists would say, well, hang on, we don't know. What happens if Al-Qaeda or ISIS get a nuclear, or Daesh get a nuclear weapon? So I think this would be a slightly different argument. But anyway, lots of transformationists over there, so, yep.
My name is I'm PhD fellow in Department of Political Science, Jamia, Islamia. I'm in favor of transformation because it is not just, globalization is not just impacting the developed countries, it is also impacting the developing countries. So even the argument of capitalists and globalists, it is surrounding around the developed countries, that the powerful nations have protectionist policies, or they are the surveillance power of the state is increasing. But the state is playing a very important role in developing nations. They are providing food security to the citizens. Even if the surveillance might have increased, but that is for the human security purposes only. Because if someone is planning something and we are having a full vigilance over that, so that is covering that part also. So argument of that the state being too powerful is not that true, because on its own no country can use a nuclear power. So I mean that support, because of this view, because of the transformation, because of the integration of the world at the United Nations, we can take our issues to the United Nations, we can discuss there, and therefore the global civil society comes into the picture.
Okay.
I support this.
Anybody else over here? Yeah, please.
So adding on to what I'm Rohit Raj from the Department of Political Science, Jamia. So basically the focus more or less revolves in the previous two concepts, that is the globalists and the statists. We want more around the states. Now the focus in the transformationist, it goes on to the civil society also. I mean, the engagement of society, civil society, across, I mean, cultural, economic, political engagements across these states. I mean, the conventional states. So that is something, I mean, the debate, what I feel is that the globalization has more or less helped this entire, I mean, the concept of governance to be looked into a new narrative. I mean, looking from the point of view of transnational governance or a global governance. So that is something that strikes me to support this discussion.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if we could listen to more people first. Yeah, thank you.
I would agree with what you said. Also, a transformationist ideology has changed the individual towards the state government. We have more governments, we have more collaborative governments and cooperative governments. So the state takes into cognizance of what citizens want at the grassroots level. And there is no participating governments that has come up as compared to the skeptics or the other.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Right now what we are experiencing is the part of globalization only. The government of India provides the governance system, and a professor from a developed country is into a developing country and providing us the information. So the transformationist view stands for my day.
But state is here, that is
State is watching for the benefits that rather than...
Yeah, but am I inside or outside? That's one of the key issues. So why did they not get somebody who is fully Japanese or somebody fully American or British? So inside or outside is a different point. Anyway, any others for the transformationalist perspective who we haven't heard from? Well, we've heard from you, but you haven't said anything today. Okay.
I'll go with transformationist because in every respect, being it a health issue or any other, we always see state backing us for everything. If we take a small example of the outbreak of Ebola virus or any other issue, so we cannot simply ignore state's role in bringing out the development or any sort of good world for a smallest unit of population being a good citizen or something. So we cannot just ignore state's role in it. So
thank you very much. Yep.
I also support transformation.
If you could also reintroduce us to who you are.
I'm Shaiza. I'm a PhD scholar in Jamia. So I'm saying, yes, of course, I also support in the role of trade, you are actually questioning the very foundation of this entire, understanding of the nation states, all that. So you can never say that the state does not exist or the state's role is not there. It will be there in some way or the other, maybe in a little lesser form, in a little diluted form maybe. But then that too, it is the state's own wish. If a state wants, it can go ahead and be more of a restricted state. And if not, they are getting more liberal. It is a state's decision to decide if it wants to be active or it wants to subdue its role.
Then you'd be a skeptic. You have to sit over here.
The only question that I have is, I don't agree with this point to say the state is still important. It can no longer provide governance and security for its citizens on its own. It is, I don't get this point.
No, I think one thing to add to this would be on its own in the sense that when we're talking about globalization, it's not only the free flow of labor capital, it's also the free flow of information and technology. So, exactly. So when this point says that it cannot provide governance and security for its citizens on its own, in the sense that especially countries like India, third world countries, would extensively rely on technology to provide that security. So I think to broaden the concept of globalization would include a lot, not simply just the traditional aspects of it, labor capital.
We don't live in a vacuum anymore.
Exactly. So even if you're exchanging information, that's part of globalization.
Actually, cyber security can be the best example I ever. Thank you.
Okay, anybody in the periphery who we haven't heard from? No, we've heard from you. So,
We have a doubt.
anybody outside? Huh?
We have a doubt.
Oh, you have a doubt? Okay. But firstly, anybody outside who, does anyone over there want to say something? Okay, we'll go back to you. That'll be the final comment.
Governance is also something that relies on a lot of things. Right? No, but governance, I will give you an example. If we are currently talking about demonetization and we are talking about going online, so a lot of that, giving technology for doing that, also is part of globalization. So that
is something different from the technology, let's say.
Okay, but this course looks at security, so I'd like to focus very much on security. One last point I'd like to make is about the role of the state. This is what we looked at yesterday. Now, part of the argument here, which skeptics make, is that the state is still important. The state is still strong in this sense and has been strengthened as a result of globalization. Now, that may be true or may not be true, but what we haven't looked at is the role which we are playing in the reproduction of state power. By invoking the national security paradigm, our focus is always on the state. So if we look at the globalization debate, the main point of debate between all three different schools was the role of state power. Now, if we are to take globalization seriously, then we need to look at how globalization has delinked security from the state and made possible different security imaginaries, different discourses or narratives of security which don't have the state at its center. And this is what we're going to do tomorrow by looking at human security. So tomorrow we will spend 2 lectures looking at human security. I will introduce you to the concept of human security, the history of human security, and we will go through the narrow and broad approaches. And we will have a debate in the time we have remaining, and this will carry on in the first lecture of Thursday. So it'll end 3 o'clock on Thursday. Okay, thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
So thank you very much. So this concludes the day 2 of the GIAN program, Advanced Studies in Human Security.
So tomorrow will be day 3, as Professor Shani rightly said. On globalization, I just realized a couple of years ago when we had a national conference conducted on behalf of the Department of Political Science at Jamia, and we had a book that was published out of the conference titled Globalization and the Role of the State, edited by Basu, and which some of us, including myself, we had some chapters. So if you see Professor Basu will be here. I think tomorrow she would like to attend and listen to some of the lectures today. So again, welcome to, please come tomorrow morning, okay, for the third day of the GIAN program. Tomorrow as the usual time. So be here by 1:30, 1:40 because we might have some announcements, okay, and the real class will start as usual at 2 o'clock, okay. So thank you very much.